The late 1980s were a strange era for motorcycle racing, a time when the sport balanced between raw mechanical fury and the dawn of modern engineering. At the center of this shift stood a machine that looked like a standard racing bike but hid something extraordinary inside: the Norton RCW588. A name that doesn't just whisper British pride, it howls rebellion. Underneath its black and gold livery beat a heart unlike any other. A 588 cubic centimeter twin-rotor Wankel rotary engine, liquid-cooled and terrifyingly compact. It was a bold declaration that Norton, a company long past its golden years, wasn't done fighting yet. The world saw pistons, valves, and cylinders as the only way forward. Norton saw something entirely different: triangles spinning inside an oval chamber, a concept that promised fewer moving parts, less vibration, and near-limitless revolutions. On paper, it was madness that made sense. The RCW588's power figures were stunning: over 135 horsepower at just under 10,000 RPM and 77 pound-feet of torque at 8,000 RPM. For a machine accepted into the 500cc Grand Prix class, this was a cheat code disguised as engineering. The FIM, the sport's governing body, even agreed that Norton's 588cc rotary could compete as if it were a 500cc piston engine. It was a quiet nod of respect, or perhaps curiosity. But the shocking truth begins here. While the idea looked brilliant on paper, the reality was a brutal test of ambition, temperature, and patience. The Wankel rotary wasn't new. Engineers had toyed with it for decades, drawn by its elegance, one rotating piece doing the work of 4 pistons. Mazda made it famous with the RX-7, but in motorcycles, it was still an alien. Few dared to use it, and fewer still succeeded. Suzuki had tried with the RE5, and even they couldn't make it practical. But Norton wasn't chasing practicality. They were chasing history. The early prototypes were born in Shenstone, Staffordshire, under the obsessive eye of Brian Crighton. Crighton wasn't a traditional mechanic. He came from electronic engineering, the kind of mind that saw inefficiency as a personal insult. Working in Norton's service department for police bikes, he discovered the rotary's secret potential. The engines used by police patrols were dependable, but underpowered, coughing out around 79 brake horsepower. Crichton knew it could give double that, if only someone would let him try. Nobody did, so he worked on it after hours. Alone, surrounded by tools and aluminum shavings, Crichton began reimagining the rotary engine like a sculptor reshaping metal into art. He reduced the cooling fin area, adjusted the internal ports, and designed a ram air induction system using fairing-mounted air scoops, something Honda would later claim as an innovation, even though Crichton had done it years earlier. When the first prototype roared to life at Darley Moor in 1987 with test rider Malcolm Heath, the world barely noticed. But those who did couldn't believe what they saw. A Norton that accelerated like a banshee and sounded like no other motorcycle on Earth. The whirring tone of the twin rotors screamed higher, smoother, and stranger than any piston bike. By 1989, the RCW588 was fully liquid-cooled, and with sponsorship from John Player and Sons, the black and gold Norton, now branded as the JPS Norton, became a legend in motion. Crichton's creation went from garage experiment to championship contender almost overnight. Riders like Trevor Nation, Simon Buckmaster, and later Steve Spray and Robert Dunlop joined the team. Against all odds, they weren't just competing, they were winning. In 1989, Steve Spray delivered Norton's comeback moment, winning the British Formula One Championship. That was the spark. The fire came 3 years later. In 1992, the Isle of Man TT, one of the most dangerous races in the world, witnessed a moment that stunned everyone. Steve Hyslop, riding the Norton RCW588 nicknamed the White Charger, tore through the 37.73-mile course with speed and precision that seemed impossible for a rotary bike. He didn't just win, he beat the reigning champion on a Honda RC30, a machine considered unbeatable at the time. Norton hadn't won the TT since 1961. That day, they did. The world had to take notice. A rotary-engined bike had beaten the best piston machines on the planet. But beneath the champagne and applause, cracks were beginning to form. Not in the chassis, but in the concept itself. The rotary's beauty was also its curse. It ran smoother because there were fewer moving parts, but that meant more heat stayed trapped inside. The apex seals, tiny metal tips that kept the compression tight within the chambers, wore out faster than anyone expected. Overheating was constant. At high speed, the reduced cooling fin area helped, but at lower speeds, the heat built up dangerously. Even police units using Norton's road versions reported overheating and blown rotor seals. Keeping a racing rotary engine healthy was expensive, painfully so. A single rebuild could cost several $1,000s, and it had to be done often. The RCW588's appetite for maintenance was far greater than its rivals. Where a Honda or Yamaha could run a full season with predictable service intervals, the Norton's engine needed constant nursing. Engineers had to tear it apart and rebuild it like a fragile supercar, every component checked, every seal questioned. Fuel consumption was another hidden enemy. Rotary engines by nature burn more fuel than their piston counterparts. The Norton's engine guzzled at a rate that horrified race strategists. It produced enormous heat and used oil in the combustion process itself, meaning the exhaust sometimes puffed out visible blue smoke, a reminder that even victory had a cost. For all its brilliance, the RCW588 was like a genius athlete with brittle bones, magnificent in performance, fragile in reality. Yet the wins kept coming. Norton's riders dominated smaller circuits across the UK. Cadwell Park, Mallory Park, Thruxton, and the legend grew. By 1994, Ian Simpson rode a Crighton-developed rotary to victory in the British Superbike Championship, this time under Duckham's Oil sponsorship. It was proof that the rotary could still stand tall among the giants. Behind the scenes, though, Norton was unraveling. Brian Crighton had left the company in 1990, frustrated by corporate politics. New management brought in Barry Simmons, formerly of Honda Britain, to run the race team. Crighton continued as a consultant for a while, but eventually moved on to form his own shadow project called Norton, taking the rotary idea into independent hands. His dream didn't die, it evolved. He partnered with Chris Oldfield, an Australian businessman who wanted to fund a team of his own. The Norton made its way to the Australian Grand Prix at Eastern Creek, where it managed a 15th place finish, earning a single world championship point. Modest on paper, but symbolically massive, it meant the rotary still had fight left in it. Then came the road version, the Norton F1, essentially a softened, street-legal variant of the RCW588. Painted in the same JPS black and gold, it looked like a racer tamed for the road. But the truth was that the rotary engine never really behaved. It ran hot, loud, and temperamental. Buyers loved its rarity, but everyday riders struggled to maintain it. The cost of ownership was staggering, far higher than any rival superbike. Parts were hard to source, few mechanics understood how to tune it, and the heat from the exhaust could roast the rider's legs in traffic. Only a few hundred were ever built, and their prices reflected the exclusivity, selling for well over $30,000 in the early 1990s, a figure that would easily double or triple today on the collector market. But the deeper truth behind the Norton RCW588 wasn't just about engineering, it was about the cost of being different. Norton dared to challenge an industry dominated by piston perfection, and in doing so, it exposed the limits of that defiance. As the 1990s progressed, the world moved towards stricter emission standards. Rotary engines struggled here too. The design's tendency to burn oil and fuel inefficiently meant higher emissions, making it harder to certify for road use. By the mid-1990s, Norton's rotary program quietly faded. Yet the legend didn't vanish. It lingered, in garages, in stories, in the hearts of engineers who couldn't forget that haunting, high-pitched rotary wail. Even today, collectors hunt for RCW58s and F1s, willing to pay six-figure prices for pristine examples. The rarity, the history, and the audacity make them irresistible. But owning one isn't easy. The engines require expert care, often from the few specialists who truly understand rotary internals. Parts can take months to find, and the smallest rebuild can cost over $10,000. It's not a motorcycle you buy to ride, it's one you buy to preserve a story. And that story is still evolving, because Brian Crighton never gave up. When Norton's racing program began to fade in the mid-1990s, many thought the rotary dream had ended for good. The world was shifting toward digital fuel injection, emissions compliance, and refined piston engines that could be mass-produced with predictable results. The rotary, on the other hand, was unpredictable, a marvel on the track, a nightmare in the workshop. But for Brian Crighton, it was unfinished business. He couldn't let go of the hum of those spinning rotors, the pure mechanical poetry that few others truly understood. To him, the Wankel wasn't just an engine, it was a challenge that deserved closure. So, years after leaving Norton, he went back to his roots. This time, not under the strict eye of corporate boards or sponsorship contracts, but in his own workshop. There, Crighton began creating something new, the CR700P, a direct descendant of the RCW588, but stripped of compromise. The numbers were astonishing. By enlarging the rotor chambers to 700 cc and introducing a sealed, pressurized gas cooling system that used an external belt-driven pump, Crighton solved one of the rotary's oldest problems: heat. The system circulated gas through an intercooler tucked neatly under the seat tailpiece, keeping temperatures consistent even under brutal track conditions. The result? A power output of 200 brake horsepower with safe, stable operation. To put that into perspective, the CR700P produced more horsepower than a MotoGP bike of the early 2000s, from an engine smaller than a loaf of bread. The torque was monstrous, the throttle response instant. Engineers who saw it in action described it as mechanical violence disguised as smoothness. And yet, despite its brilliance, it remained a ghost project, admired but rarely seen. Hand-built, expensive, and terrifyingly fast, the CR700P became something of a legend among racing insiders. Crichton's small-scale production meant that only a few lucky riders ever experienced it. Each machine was said to cost upward of $120,000, depending on configuration and customization. Then came its successor, the CR700W, an evolution that pushed geometry and compression to near-perfect balance. It used a redesigned rotor housing with 80mm width, thinner intermediate plates, and a generating radius of 71 millimeters. It produced 220 horsepower at 10,500 RPM and 105 pound-feet of torque at 9,500 RPM, figures that could embarrass many modern superbikes even today. The engineering precision behind these numbers was staggering. The mean effective pressure, the measurement of how efficiently an engine converts combustion into motion, was 1.36 megapascals, a figure usually reserved for top-tier race engines. In essence, Crichton had taken the flawed heart of the Norton RCW588 and turned it into a masterpiece of refinement. But history can be cruel to those who innovate outside the mainstream. Rotary engines were no longer fashionable, and the world's major manufacturers had long moved on. The CR700P and CR700W became boutique creations, brilliant, exclusive, and misunderstood. For collectors and engineers, however, these machines were sacred relics. They represented the culmination of everything Norton's rotary dream had promised, but never fully achieved: immense power, stability, and balance. Each CR700W that rolled out of Crichton's small facility was essentially handcrafted art, a symphony of aluminum, gas, and precision machining. Meanwhile, Norton Motorcycles itself went through turbulent years. Ownership changed hands multiple times, but the rotary ghost refused to die. Under Stuart Garner, Norton briefly revisited the concept with an updated rotary prototype called the NRV588, which made appearances at the 2009 Isle of Man TT. That version, ridden by Michael Dunlop, used a Spondon aluminum twin-spar frame and single side-mounted rear suspension, proof that the design still had potential decades later. It roared through the course, reviving old memories of Steve Hislop's victory 17 years earlier. Even if it didn't win, it reminded everyone that the Norton rotary wasn't forgotten, just sleeping. The NRV588 and its predecessors became the ultimate paradox of engineering. Machines too advanced for their time, yet too temperamental for mass production. The technology worked, but the world around it wasn't ready to support it. That's the shocking truth about the RCW588. It didn't fail because it was bad. It failed because it was alone. The rotary's biggest enemies weren't the rival bikes on the track. They were the laws of thermodynamics, the economics of manufacturing, and the unforgiving nature of racing logistics. Every other team had decades of experience with piston engines, hundreds of engineers who knew how to squeeze performance from them. Norton had a handful of men trying to rewrite the rulebook. Keeping an RCW588 in race-ready condition was like owning a thoroughbred racehorse. It demanded constant attention, endless patience, and deep pockets. Each race weekend could cost tens of thousands of dollars in maintenance, tuning, and parts replacement. The reward was spectacular speed, but the risk was equally enormous. And yet, when the Norton hit full stride, it was poetry on wheels. The exhaust note wasn't the sharp bark of a four-cylinder. It was a smooth, high-frequency howl, a mechanical symphony that made grown men stop in their tracks. Spectators described it as a jet engine wrapped in carbon fiber. Every rider who sat on one remembered the feeling. Steve Hyslop once said that the Norton felt different from anything else, smoother, lighter, and eerily alive. The power band didn't surge like a piston bike. It built like a wave, relentless and unstoppable. On the TT course, it was the perfect weapon. But performance alone doesn't guarantee survival. By the time Norton's rotary era ended, the motorcycle world had entered a new age, one ruled by digital management systems, data telemetry, and multinational budgets. The RCW588 was born in the wrong century, too analog for the digital dawn. Still, its influence quietly endured. Engineers studying high-efficiency engines often point to the Norton rotary as a reference for compact power density. Its ability to generate over 200 brake horsepower per liter remains remarkable even by modern standards. The principles of balanced combustion chambers and lightweight rotating mass have inspired both aviation and experimental vehicle projects. Collectors today pay small fortunes for surviving RCW58s and F1s. A pristine example can fetch over $150,000 at auction, depending on provenance and race history. The White Charger Hyslop rode in 1992 is priceless, a machine frozen in time, symbolizing the moment a British underdog defied the giants of Japan. But owning one isn't a casual hobby. Specialists capable of servicing these rotaries are few, and spare parts are often custom-made. A single set of rotor seals can cost several $1,000s, and full engine rebuilds can easily exceed $15,000. Yet enthusiasts pay it willingly, driven by respect for what the RCW588 represents: the courage to be different. Looking back, the Norton rotary story reads like a Shakespearean tragedy. A brilliant engineer with an unorthodox idea, a legendary company desperate for revival, and a machine that could have changed everything if only the world had been ready. The irony is that Norton's downfall wasn't caused by failure, but by success. The RCW588 proved that the rotary worked, but also that it couldn't coexist with traditional racing economics. It was too complex, too costly, and too misunderstood to survive in a world that values predictability over perfection. And yet, the legacy remains profound. The RCW588 forced engineers to rethink how engines could function. It challenged assumptions about reciprocating motion and combustion efficiency. It proved that smaller could be mightier, that innovation could come from anywhere, even a struggling British workshop with a handful of dreamers. More than 3 decades later, the rotary still haunts the motorcycle world like an unfinished symphony. Every few years, whispers emerge about new rotary experiments, hybrid adaptations, or alternative cooling methods. Most trace their roots back to what Norton dared to attempt. At its core, the RCW588 wasn't simply a motorcycle. It was a message that progress often hides in discomfort, that perfection is sometimes too fragile for mass production, and that history remembers those who tried, even if they failed. The shocking truth behind the Norton RCW588 isn't that it broke down or ran hot or cost too much. It's that it revealed what happens when human ambition meets mechanical limits, when vision outpaces practicality. It was a machine built on contradictions. Compact yet powerful, simple yet complex, smooth yet violent. It could outperform its rivals, yet destroy itself doing so. It was both the future and the past. A glimpse of what could have been, frozen forever in the echo of a rotary howl. Today, when a Crighton CR700W fires up on a private test track, Its sound carries more than power. It carries history. That sharp, swirling tone reminds those who listen that brilliance doesn't always survive, but it never truly disappears. And so, the RCW588 lives on, not just in museums or collector garages, but in the hearts of those who still believe in engineering without compromise. A motorcycle that shouldn't have worked, yet it did. A victory that shouldn't have happened, yet it did. A dream that shouldn't have survived, yet somehow still does. The Norton RCW588 wasn't merely an engine. It was defiance given form, steel, and fire. And that, perhaps, is the most shocking truth of all.